everybody. Tonight we're going to jump into section 6, which is about inflation, unemployment, and stabilization. You can see here the 7 modules that we're going to cover, and in those 7 modules we're going to talk about 3 basic themes. The first is a more in-depth discussion and analysis of stabilization policies and what they do. Second, we'll talk about trade-offs between inflation and unemployment, and then the third, we'll talk about the role of expectations in the economy. Let's jump right in. Module 30 is long-run implications of fiscal policy, or deficits in the public debt. Remember in 24 we learned that expansionary policy can help in a recession to shift aggregate demand to the right, basically to get an economy moving again. And contractionary policy can help to ease inflation in those expansions so we don't, again, so that the economy doesn't heat up. What we haven't addressed though yet is how these policies affect the economy over a longer period of time. We're going to do that today in terms of 3 different things: the budget balance, debt versus the deficit, and then liabilities, long-term government liabilities. So budget discussions tend to focus on surplus as good and deficits as bad. Whether you're talking with economists or you're talking with politicians or just people in general, people tend to think if you spend more than you have, that's a bad thing. If you spend less than you have, that's a good thing. Now, the question is, can the opposite ever be true? Well, let's start with just a little bit of review of definitions. So a surplus, what's that? Surplus is a positive budget balance, and a deficit is a negative budget balance. Remember what budget balance is. That is where S equals government savings, T is taxes, G is government purchases, and the TR equals transfers. So we're talking about surplus when we actually have more savings than we have spending on the right. Deficit is when we have less savings than we have spending on the right. Expansionary policies again happen when we have increases in government expenditures and transfer payments and or decreases in taxes. Tends to decrease the budget balance. Contractionary policies happen when we have decreases in government spending or transfers and I say and or because they don't always all 3 happen, an increase in taxes, and that increases the budget balance. So if the budget balance is measured this way, can we use that to decide whether fiscal policy is really expansionary or contractionary? Not necessarily, and we can't for 2 reasons. The first is that 2 different but similarly sized fiscal policies can have very different impacts on the budget balance, as we've learned in the past. So you could have the same level of taxation and the same level of government purchases. Government purchases would be magnified by the multiplier effect, for example. So you really can't look at those 2 numbers. The second is that changes in the budget balance are often the result of and not the cause of fluctuations in the economy. And to understand number 2, let's talk about the business cycle again. So what's the business cycle? The business cycle is this tendency for the economy to go into expansions and recessions. White is the area of an expansion, purple is the area of a recession. So again, business cycle just from a definition, short-run alternations between economic upturns and downturns. You'll notice here the budget deficit, which is the purple line, increases during recessions and decreases during expansions. Now this makes sense because the budget deficit increases when unemployment increases, and that's what happens in a recession, and then it decreases when unemployment decreases. Remember this idea of automatic stabilizers? Well, the automatic stabilizers cause the budget to move towards surplus during expansions. And again, during an expansion, those automatic stabilizers are increases in taxes because the economy is doing better. Businesses are producing more, so there's more tax revenue. And also, as more people get jobs and have jobs during an expansion, there are fewer government transfers. So this stabilizer is going to move the budget toward a surplus, which is down here. And then it is going to, on the flip side, move us toward deficits when there's a recession. Now, let's talk about assessing budget policy. So we all remember the business cycle effects on the budget balance are temporary. Recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps tend to be eliminated in the long run, as we saw back in section 4. And the automatic stabilizers happen independent of fiscal policy. So To assess the budget policy, or in other words, assess the government's taxing and spending policies and determine whether they're sustainable in the long run, we're trying to think about long-term economic health, we look at something called the cyclically adjusted budget balance. What that does is create an estimate of what the budget balance would be if GDP equaled potential output, remember Y, GDP, or the letter Y, GDP equaling potential tends to get rid of those cyclical heights in the deficit and lows in the deficit when we're in either a significant expansion or in a significant recession. The good thing about the cyclically adjusted budget balance is that it doesn't fluctuate as much as the actual budget deficit, so it gives us a better sense of long-term taxing and spending policies to see whether over the long term they're actually sustainable. This brings us to a question: should the budget be balanced? Well, politicians like to increase spending without increasing taxes, or they like to cut taxes without cutting spending. So everybody likes to do that. Everybody wants something for nothing. What this has done over time has led to deficits. Now, today we're talking about, in political circles, we're talking about whether we should have a balanced budget every year. Economists would say no. We need to balance it on average instead, because this allows the automatic stabilizers we talked about, so increases in taxes, decreases in taxes, and also those increases and decreases in government transfers. It allows those stabilizers to limit recessions. If we were forced to balance the budgets, we would have to limit spending in recessions, and limiting spending in a recessionary time tends to increase the severity and duration of the recession, which runs contrary to economic thought, which is you want to stabilize the economy in the long run. So does this mean we can run a deficit every year? Well, if we did that, there are two problems we'd run into. The first is crowding out. Crowding out, remember, governments would be borrowing and competing in the same market for loanable funds that businesses do, and that drives up interest rates. The second is it puts pressure on future budgets. Let's talk about that. When we talk about deficits and debt in practice, we tend to take a longer-term view. This is the two graphs here. We have the U.S. federal budget deficit since 1940 on the left, and then the public debt to GDP ratio since 1940. You'll notice here that we've run a deficit almost every year since 1940, including huge deficits during wartime. We had a very, very strong expansion at the end of the 40s. We had a two-year basically expansion, or rather two-year surplus environment, and we've returned to deficits. And of particular concern here is this significant increase in the last couple of years. Importantly, to assess the ability of governments to pay their debt, we use the debt to GDP ratio, and that's because GDP is a good indicator of the amount of taxes that will be raised to pay debt. So debt's a bad thing if you can't pay it back. And as you can see here, for the 30 years following World War II, we actually were able to handle these nearly consistent or nearly constant deficits because GDP was growing so much. And even into the 80s and 90s and into the very late 90s, we didn't have an explosion in our debt to GDP ratio, but we did see it increasing. Then we saw a decrease, and now it's back up significantly. The good news here is if the government's debt grows more slowly than GDP, the burden of paying the debt is decreasing, which is a good thing. And this shows that, sort of in summary, debt can grow over time as long as GDP grows faster. Now, problems posed by rising government debt. Two things again we talked about: crowding out private investment and financial pressures on future budgets. Let's take a look at our friends in Greece as a great example of this happening. So what's happened in Greece? Well, take a look first at how the country's debts and budget deficits compare when you're looking at Eurozone countries. Look here at a country like the UK, 13% of their budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, higher than the US is, almost 3 times higher. But look at Greece, where it's not quite, it's nearly the same number in terms of the budget deficit, but look at debt. Long-term debt has exploded in Greece and in Italy and causes huge concerns when we think about their ability to pay back that debt. If you look at it another way with Greece, look at this. From 2000 to 2006, really, there wasn't much of a problem in Greece because their economy was growing. If you look at the GDP, the red, their economy was growing just as fast as their debt was. What happened here in 2005 is Greece ceased to be competitive in the international marketplace. There was also an international recession. So their GDP fell, but they didn't stop spending, and they didn't stop to think that maybe they had to spend less because their GDP was falling, and as a result, their debt to GDP ratio absolutely exploded. Now, we've talked about public debt, but we haven't talked about something called implicit liabilities. That's the last thing we'll talk about today. Implicit liabilities are spending promises made by governments that are, in effect, a debt, but not included in the usual debt statistics. What are those? Well, the big three, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are the big three for the U.S., and when I say big, they are 40% of the government's annual spending. The problem we have is twofold. Not only are they a huge percent of our spending, but look at what happens here, and this is a 2008 estimate. Look what happens here over time. We have an aging population that's going to consume more and more and more in Medicaid and Medicare in terms of percentage of our overall GDP. And the population that's been paying into the Social Security fund and into Medicare and Medicaid, well, this is a system that pays, basically we pay today in order to be able to, we pay into the system to be able to pay out of it later. So those of us who work today all pay taxes on our wages in order to pay Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Well, as the percentage of non-working people, so those retirees, increases relative to those of us who are still working, not only are healthcare costs going to skyrocket, but there will be fewer of us to pay for these bills over time. That's something we're going to get into a little bit later. We're going to stop the video now. I have more slides to show you guys tomorrow. But that's it for tonight. So have a good night, and I will talk to you tomorrow.